If you've never been to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, allow me to give you a couple of crucial bits of insight from a person who lived there for a very long time. There are basically like 3 or 4 roads in the entire town that are actually useful. The big ones, like McFarland Boulevard or University, tend to get the most attention, but traffic is usually a nightmare on both of them, especially on game day, and unless you have absolutely no other choice, I personally would recommend avoiding them. My personal favorite is Jack Warner, which runs right along the Black Warrior River and gets you pretty much anywhere you need to go on campus without nearly as much headache. But our story begins where 2 other useful Tuscaloosa roads, specifically 15th Street and Hackberry Lane, meet. This is actually a pretty well-known location all on its own. If you came off 15th Street, crossed the railroad tracks, went a little ways and looked to your right, you'd see the Alabama football complex, presumably with its fences covered up like it was some sort of highly classified military facility. And across the street from all that is an apartment complex. Not exactly a unique feature, and the town with something like 40,000 college students in it, but this one is special. Because about 10 years ago from the time of recording, myself and a group of fellow students at the University of Alabama piled into one of those apartments to have a fantasy draft. We'd had fantasy drafts before, but this draft was to be the launch of our new Dynasty League, a twist on the traditional redraft fantasy league where you pick all new players every season. And I cannot overemphasize the degree to which none of us had any idea what we were doing, or what this thing would eventually turn into. All it was at the time was an admittedly ambitious attempt to create something that would not only be a fun new challenge in the short term, but also a way to keep the group together once we graduated. Because that's the thing about college. Ideally, it's supposed to end. But once it does, your whole reality changes. The Dynasty League was formed to be a way to keep in touch once we all got out of school. But a decade later, I think I can speak for everyone in saying that it's become much more than that. For those of you who are familiar with my work, it's probably from here on YouTube, where I spent the last several years on this very channel making video essays about sports psychology. But my day job is as a psychology professor, and in that role, one of my most important jobs is educating my students about how psychologists and researchers do experiments. We talk about independent variables and sample sizes and correlation coefficients and all the stuff you probably forgot the second that you finished taking the class. But one day, as I was lecturing about experiments, what they actually look like out in the wild, I realized something. If I were one of those academic types, studying social psychology or sociology or something along those lines, fantasy football leagues would be incredibly interesting to look at. There are tens of millions of people who play every year, and participating in fantasy makes them do really weird things sometimes, like root against their own teams, or devote inordinate amounts of attention to games that would otherwise not matter to them at all. Like, I would not normally be paying much attention to what's going on with the Rams' third-string running back, but because I just drafted Blake Corum, these days, I very much am. But how would we test that kind of thing? Well, first, we need to find a group of participants to form a league, and then meticulously study their behavior. But knowing that they were in an experiment might change the way they behaved while in the experiment. That kind of defeats the purpose of doing the experiment in the first place. And there would be about 1 million things that we wouldn't be able to control for, which is pretty much every experimenter's worst nightmare. To do this well, we'd need data from a group of people who've been doing this for a while on their own, and had also recorded pretty much everything as they did so. And you might be able to tell where I'm going with this, but kind of by accident, our Dynasty League has turned itself into an incredibly interesting and surprisingly consistent scientific study. We've been doing this for 10 years, a third of my lifespan at this point. And in that time, guys have gotten married, had kids, moved to other states, and just generally grown into adults. But in all that time and through all that change, at least one thing has stayed the same. Our league has been rumbling on in the background, and sometimes in the foreground, and has undergone plenty of change of its own over the years. But it's persisted through all of it, and today, my mission is to try and figure out why. Mostly by asking the people who've made the league what it is, but we're also going to look at things like what our league and fantasy sports in general can tell us about how we use the internet or social media, and why there may actually be some hope for humanity as far as all that stuff is concerned. Basically, we're going to unpack everything that's made this league what it's been and what it continues to be. The highlights, the lowlights, and everything in between. I'm Will, and this is Dynasty, the story of a league, the first ever Student of the Game special. Because while, yes, the goal of participating in the league is technically to win, the real winner in this case, quite literally, is the friends we made along the way. So let me back up a little bit. For most people, when they talk about being in a fantasy football league, what they're probably talking about is redraft. I couldn't really find any good numbers on this, but redraft is kind of the traditional way to play fantasy football and is still by far the most popular. You pick your team at the beginning of the season, and outside of setting your lineup or making the occasional trade or waiver wire pickup, you're pretty much good to go. But the downside is that once the season ends, even if your team is really good, that's kind of it. You've got to wait until next year and then do the whole thing over again. Or do you? This is Chad Parsons, a fantasy football content creator who runs under the helm at Dynasty. And like we did all those years ago in Tuscaloosa, he reached a point in his fantasy journey where he wanted to try something different, something that would reward good management in the long term rather than the short, and let you stick with the players that you spent months investing in past the end of that particular season.
If you had those moments of like, what if I didn't give up my team? What if all this work I put into it, all these great calls, I know the players, I know the teams, I would like to keep those things. And I would say that thought, when you realize that there are leagues out there that you can keep your team, all of a sudden the world kind of opens up.
Fantasy platforms like Sleeper, which is the one we use, offer several different types of fantasy formats for their players. You can do a redraft league, a keeper league, which is kind of a hybrid where you take a few players but not all of them into the next season, or a dynasty league. You can also do daily fantasy, but that's kind of its own thing over there that we're going to come back to later. But what makes Dynasty special? Like, why was that the option that we chose over all the other things available to us? I have a couple of theories on this, but the first one is that this is a group of nerds. These are exactly the kind of people that play Dynasty modes on various sports video games and then have in-depth discussions about them. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's essentially what Dynasty is. It's a franchised version of fantasy sports where you get to have way more control over everything that's going on, which, if you're doing it right, means a much more, let's call it, comprehensive experience.
Your team becomes a child to you, this developmental project of you can constantly be thinking about it, tinkering with it. I would say most Dynasty leagues are at least 11 months a year. Sometimes in January, they kind of shut down a little bit. But if you want it a higher percentage of the year, you want to actually have the benefit, for good or for bad, that the team is your own at all times. It's a pretty interesting and I would say immersive and rewarding journey that you go on with these teams, as opposed to a complete reset in January until the next year.
Dynasty is designed to be a year-round thing, but the NFL season only runs from September to February. So how does it hold people's attention for that long? If you're playing in a redraft league and your team gets off to a poor start, you're pretty much cooked. But if your Dynasty team gets off to that same poor start, you've still got plenty of things that are worth paying attention to. Even if your team is terrible, which, as you'll learn, may or may not be autobiographical, you can still enjoy things like watching your young players develop or trying to make deals for future draft assets. All paths in the Dynasty League can be legitimately enjoyable. Winning is fun because you're winning, but rebuilding is also fun because you're starting a journey with your new players. Or because you're like my friend Logan and you just enjoy being a sicko.
It's the expectations game. It's the same reason I will always and forever play as Troy on NCAA football. Because if you beat me, then what good have you really done? But if I win, it's incredible. Yeah. And it's the same thing with rebuilding in Dynasty. If you lose your matchup, well, of course you did. You're a rebuilding team. Who cares? And if you win it, how embarrassing for the contender that lost to the guy that was starting, Pierre Strong in his RB2.
Yeah. Dynasty can be fun and keep people's attention for a number of different reasons, but the main one is that more than any other type of league, it gives players a chance to think like an NFL GM. Why are Dynasty players thinking about their teams 11 months out of the year? Because that's how the NFL schedule works. Sure, the season ends in February, but then you've got free agency, then the draft, then OTAs and minicamps, all of which are relevant to Dynasty players as they try to build their teams. And the psychology of all of that is a major part of what makes these types of leagues so appealing.
We all sit on our couch and what do we think? We think, I can run a team better than some of these dopes in the NFL, right? That's the typical, at some point, you're watching your team or one team and you say, I can do it better. This is the closest 99.9% of us are ever going to get to having any say over NFL players in any capacity, and it's going to be with our fantasy teams, and really, the most extreme version is through Dynasty.
So we've established what Dynasty is and kind of how it works. But the next question is to see how these teams that we inevitably get attached to actually get built. And it's an important one, because in a league where there are only 14 game weeks in a regular season, building your team is what you're going to spend most of your time actually doing. There are three main ways that you can build your team in the Dynasty League. There's trades, the waiver wire, and most importantly, the rookie draft. In our league, the rookie draft is probably the most important date on the entire calendar. For an entire weekend, we have an annual meeting where people come in from all over the country just to choose new players for their fantasy teams. And also to go to Topgolf and play video games or whatever, but mostly for the draft. And while other leagues might not take the rookie draft as seriously as we do, that level of excitement and anticipation is what Dynasty rookie drafts are all about.
This is the moment where, again, let's face it, you can think you have the most active league, but invariably there'll be some people that until the rookie draft or about there, they won't really care. Maybe it's not until the rookie draft. They won't really tune in. Maybe they don't respond to your trade offers all that often. But the rookie draft, as you said, whether it's in person or online, that it gets people interested, it gets people together, and it gets people thinking about their teams for the first time that day, or maybe it's for the first time in 3 months.
I'm going to go all psychology nerd for a second and talk about why this level of excitement actually happens. It's the principle of intermittent reinforcement, or the idea that even though there's no guarantee that a behavior may lead to a reward, the chance that it might, no matter how small, keeps people doing the behavior. It's the same principle behind why people gamble or play the lottery. I could give you all the math on how unlikely winning actually is, but knowing that the winning ticket is out there somewhere is depressingly effective in getting people to keep buying them. And any seasoned Dynasty player will tell you that, to a certain extent, drafting rookies is pretty much just a crapshoot. You could read all the reports from draft experts or Dynasty veterans like Chad, who actually know what they're talking about, or even do some advanced scouting on your own, but there's no real way to tell whether a guy is going to be a difference maker for you or not. But as my friend Daniel pointed out, that hasn't stopped some of us from trying.
There were a couple years there where I was like legitimately rewatching guys' college games, like watching their college appearances, the tape, you know, as they say.
The chance to draft someone who ends up becoming a star is incredibly appealing because, unlike in a trade, you don't actually have to give anything up to make it happen. Just by clicking a button, you could potentially change the trajectory of your team for years to come. It could be for the worse, just as easily it is for the better, but that's not important.
It's very much the sit forward in your chair meme.
Yeah.
Like, that's what happens when like the third round of our draft comes around and everybody is convinced that their guy is going to carry their team.
But anyway, once the business time is over, it's business time. It's time to actually turn your team loose and play some fantasy football. So how's that gonna go? Let me start this part off by saying that if you were expecting this to be a story about how my team came out of nowhere to win the title, you should probably adjust those expectations. You can be good in our league or you can be bad in our league, but what you really don't want to be is average. And trust me when I tell you that my team is not getting anywhere close to that this year. We are currently in rebuilding mode, which means that in the short term at least, we suck. Most people in our league will spend their game weekends hoping that their players can do well enough to win, but at least for this season, for me, there's really no point. I've been pretty much exclusively focused on how the guys I just drafted are getting on. Speaking of which, this summer I had the 3rd overall pick, which I used to take Washington's Rome Odunze, as well as the 9th pick, which I used on Georgia's Ladd McConkey. And then I also traded up a few picks to the end of the 1st round to take Michigan's Blake Corum. Being in this part of the process definitely lowers the expectations overall, but I find that I actually get a lot of joy from watching the seeds that I've been planting through the draft start to sprout some. For instance, in week 1, I lost by nearly 30 points, which is bad. But Ladd McConkey caught his first touchdown pass, which is good. My team only scored 47 points in week 3, which is very bad, but then Rome Odunze had over 100 yards receiving, which is very good. Even in the weeks where I'm expected to lose, which, let's face it, in a season like this is going to be most, if not all of them, there's still something to get excited about as the game week starts. And the hope is that over time, as I keep adding in good players from the high draft picks I'm inevitably going to accumulate from being awful, those moments will become more and more frequent. That's the hope anyway, but for the time being, I'm stuck at the bottom, looking up at people like Daniel, whose team is actually in a position to potentially make a playoff run. But his weekly experience could not be more different from mine. If one of my players gets hurt or just doesn't produce that many points in a week, that's not really that big of a deal. But in a case like Daniel's, he has to pay very close attention to how his big point getters like Tyreek Hill are doing, because those are the guys that could carry him to the playoffs and even beyond.
Even adjacent injuries like Tua matter a lot, right? Because, Tyreek goes from being projected 18 points a week to 12 or 13 at the most. I think maybe 11 this week. So, that matters.
What Daniel is hinting at there is one of the things that makes our league so difficult to win. We've had 4 different league champions in the past 4 years, and only 2 teams have ever won the league more than once. The fact is that while having a team full of superstars would be very useful, in a 16-team league, that's probably not going to happen. A league like this is usually won on the margins, an idea that my friend Crawford, a fellow cello dweller and noted practitioner of the Surrender Cobra, is very aware of.
The league is so deep. When you're talking 16-team, 25-man rosters, I mean, you're not even scraping the bottom of the barrel at that point. You've turned the barrel over, rolled it down the hill, and you're digging in the dirt below. If you're talking guys that you will never have heard of or will never see play on a Sunday, that can be the difference in your matchup.
The people that do well in our league are usually the ones that can draft well and then navigate those margins better than everyone else. The final thing that makes our league difficult to win is something that every fantasy player has to deal with, and that's luck. You could somehow manage to get all that stuff that Crawford was talking about exactly right. Make the right trades, make the right waiver pickups at the right time, make all the right start-sit decisions. You could do all of that and still lose. If you look through our Google Sheet, which I've already popped up here a couple of times and has been meticulously maintained by my friend David and our other league commissioners over the years, you'll get the sense that when it comes to who actually wins the league, there are parts of it that you simply cannot control, and there are no exceptions to that. Although there was one guy who came pretty close.
His team had gotten so far ahead of everyone else's that everyone was playing for second, and if we put an all-star team together from the other 15 teams, it would still be a pretty close game.
If you're playing a turn-based strategy game like Monopoly or Settlers of Catan, there can come a point where everyone at the table realizes that one person has sort of hit critical mass. Like if you played the rest of the game 10 times, they're probably going to win 8 or 9. And that is the situation that we as a league found ourselves in 2021. One of our members had run so many circles around the rest of us that unless something changed significantly, we were pretty much powerless to stop him from winning the league every single year.
Essentially, if he had wanted to push all of his chips in and get whoever the highest producing players were, if he didn't already have them, he could have. And he could have just walked away with the whole thing. And I think he realized, along with the rest of us, that it was just killing. If you didn't think that you had the top 2 producers at every position in your starting lineup, you knew you were going to win that year. And so then basically it was just everyone tanking or not caring because they knew there was no chance of toppling him.
Now, I would very much like to point out here that there are no bad guys in our Dynasty League. There are only good guys, because if somebody wasn't a good guy, we would not have wanted to put up with them for over 10 years. This guy in particular is a great guy, but for a while, his avatar in our GroupMe was Thanos, because great guy or not, losing to him was becoming inevitable. And how and why things got to that point is kind of a long story on its own. But for the sake of competitive balance, something had to be done. And that something turned out to be straight up communism. So how this worked was pretty simple. We basically did an entire draft from just this guy's team. No one was safe, and you can see from the players and picks that were chosen in that draft that these were not bargain bin level assets that he was giving up. There are multiple future NFL Hall of Famers in here, as well as 6 first-round draft picks. And he didn't have to do this. Like, this is George Washington deciding to step down after 2 terms level of humility, and I want to make sure that that gets emphasized enough. Because were I to be in that same position, I'm pretty sure I would have done the exact opposite. But that, to me, is a part of what makes this league so special. It's full of guys who are kind and smart and genuinely good people, because it was designed specifically to be that way. The members of the league were chosen as such for a reason, and we've gone to great lengths to make sure that everybody feels like they're an important part of what we're doing, even when that gets really, really hard. In my opinion, maybe the greatest success our league has ever had is making people feel like they're still close. By my count, we've had guys living in something like 7 different states at various points, not even including Alabama, the one that all this started in and where most of our people still live. We've moved around quite a lot, but unquestionably, the best example of that idea is Logan, because his big move actually required a passport.
I mostly want to talk to you about or distance dynasty, I guess is probably the best way to say it, because you're definitely the furthest flung of all of our.
I believe geographically I hold that crown, yes.
Logan's dynasty journey is particularly interesting because for a pretty big chunk of it, he was living just south of Paris while he was in business school. And I don't mean Paris, Texas, by the way, although he did live in Texas for a bit too. I mean the actual Paris with the Arc de Triomphe and the Louvre and all that stuff. But disappointingly, it does seem like there was still some actual work being done while he was there.
I had a vision in my head of you, specifically in the France days, like checking your lineup with like a baguette in one hand and in the other. Are you telling me that's not what was happening?
At least setting my lineup, that's about what was happening.
If there are any expats watching this, you're probably all too familiar with the kind of scene that Logan described to me around the Super Bowl in 2021. Tom Brady's Bucks were playing Patrick Mahomes' Chiefs at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time in the US, but that's past midnight in France, which meant that Logan had to make a decision.
I remember waking up at halftime, seeing that, I'm just looking at the score, this is not off the top of my head, but it was 21-6, and falling back asleep. Just like, that was how I had to follow sports for a while. It's the equivalent of like being a US Premier League fan and having a team playing at like 4 a.m. You wake up, you see if the game is worth it, and if not, you head back to sleep. And it was very similar for like fantasy football purposes.
Logan's experience with keeping up with his fantasy team supports a pretty important idea in psychology, which is that whenever you have a big change to your environment, you tend to change your behavior to compensate. And just to remind you, we started this league when we were all about to experience several big changes to our environment. That idea is also supported by academic research, particularly from a time in the not-too-distant past where the whole world went through a pretty big change and was forced to adjust. During the lockdown periods of COVID, surveys like this one noted a distinct increase in the use of video contact, particularly among young people, when in-person contact wasn't available. This is evidence for a theory known as the model of compensatory technology use, which basically says that when people feel socially isolated or distressed, they turn to the internet to help fill that hole. We'll come back to the implications of that in a bit, but to try and understand it a little bit better and see how it related to our league, I brought in an expert. Dr. Annie Maheux is a psychology professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who studies, among other things, how digital media affects adolescent development. Recently, she's been focusing specifically on how things like internet gaming can facilitate social relationships, a category which our league definitely falls into, and how things like it may be able to help address one of the most important issues in social psychology today.
There's like overwhelming research that adults in America are really lonely, and like more lonely now than they really ever have been. It's probably not just one thing, but it's like digital media and like the decline of like organized religion or other like just community, engagements. And so opportunities like this where there's like a community, so it's not just like you and one other person having this like dyadic friendship, but actually like a network of people who are all part of the same community that is like facilitated across time and space.
See, for a long time, I've had this working theory that people's attitudes towards things like social media and internet communities can be a little too narrow. In August 2024, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey that found that 69% of parents believe that it's harder to be a teenager today than it was 20 years ago. And of that group, 41% cited social media as the reason why. And that's not even the part that freaked me out. 26% of that group said that technology in general was the reason that growing up is harder than it used to be, which I gotta say, doesn't really line up with my experience. I know it's a small sample size, but between the technology required to actually run our league and video software like Zoom, I've been able to stay relationally close to a lot of these guys, even when I wasn't physically close to them. It's a paradox. Things like social gaming can be a threat to connectedness in a lot of scenarios, but in others, it can also be a way to create it. And that's exactly what I told Annie.
In this case, kind of the way that I would want to push back on it is using things like gaming or digital media through via fantasy sports as a tool. Like kind of it's it doesn't have to be quite that diametric. It doesn't have to be like this is good, this is bad. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, that's like you just described my entire career in like one sentence. Do you feel like this fantasy league is a game first and a social experience second, or really be like an opportunity or a context for your social relationships to play out?
I think initially it was more game forward. I think we're like, this would be a fun thing to do. We were experimenting in that way. And I think as the years have gone by, it has much more transitioned into the social element.
Well, it sounds amazing. I mean, it sounds like so great. Something that I think most adults, like of all identities, really want and a lot of people don't have.
Now, I was pretty happy to hear that for a number of different reasons. First, because you never know how someone's going to react to telling them that you've spent literally hundreds of hours of your life playing fantasy sports, or that you've been in that same fantasy league for over a decade and still haven't won it. But secondly, because I find it highly encouraging that there are people in academia looking at this kind of stuff with the level of seriousness that I think it deserves. Dr. Maheux is absolutely one of those people. And as our interview went on, I couldn't help but notice that she took this opportunity to do some investigating of her own.
Well, my question for you is, do you think that this online sports league has facilitated your friendships with those particular people, and or has it displaced the opportunity for you to make new friends in the new location where you are, where you could have more in-person friendships?
It's hard not to kind of try and imitate the same things, because I remember moving to South Carolina and getting asked to be in a fantasy league. Be like, yeah, done that before. It's great. And just having a completely different experience, and then being like, it wasn't like what I expected it to be. So I didn't go back. But I don't know if it prevented me or anyone else from branching out and forming relationships, but it definitely, if you stack up, because I've known these guys for years, in some cases since I was a very literal child, it's really hard to recreate that. And so sort of stacking up anything that I would form now up against that would be difficult anyway, but specifically through the fantasy lens too, it's like, oh, well, this isn't the same.
The hard part about being distant from people like Logan is that, for me, he was one of those childhood friends. We grew up 15 minutes from each other and have been in each other's lives either directly or indirectly for over 25 years now. But as soon as we graduated college, he was in a different state and then in a different country. And changes like that for people around that age are more the norm than the exception. The social changes that people experience upon graduating college and entering the workforce are massive, the reasons for which are outlined in an article from the New York Times in 2012. Namely, those are proximity, repeated and unplanned interactions, and settings that encourage people to let their guard down. I can't speak for every group of millennials that went to college together, but that pretty much describes exactly how a lot of these friendships developed.
In college, I certainly did not, and I think most people don't appreciate the extent to which proximity creates friendships and proximity sustains friendships. And if you're just not around and don't have a reason to interact with somebody, then a lot of times friendships don't last over that stretch.
But our friendships largely have lasted. And the league obviously isn't the only reason for that, but I think it's a big one. Even though our lives look basically nothing like they did when we were in college, the Dynasty League has remained. Sort of by accident, we created a kind of social bridge, not only from one life stage to the next, but also to the members of the league that we were no longer physically or relationally as close to, but still wish to be.
This league is like the one stroke of genius from college, from when most people are just idiots and not thinking years ahead. Because I was there when we first started kicking this around, and we were like, essentially, let's make a list of people that we would love to keep up with. Let's pretend this league just keeps happening after graduation. And here we are, a decade later, and I am still texting people about trades, but it's rarely like, oh, we checked the trade offer that went through, because normally it's a terrible trade offer. But it's also and also I saw that you had a kid, or I saw that you changed jobs, or I saw it gives that easy prompt to end up talking to these friends more often than I might, reach out to family members, because you're thinking of something. You see the sport, that sport is connected to your league, which is connected to your friends. And so then you immediately want to reach out to them. And so I think that it has done exactly that. I don't know that I would have any prompting or reason to reach out to people other than the attempt to try to keep up. But people that you have the best intentions of keeping up with, you end up not spending as much time talking to as you age, because that's just how life works. And so it's kind of been this constant prompt for us, which has been incredible.
Yeah, and I think that as I have moved cities now, I think the thing that I have found one of the hardest is, and it is partially true, just adult friendships in general, but needing that kind of, like you said, prompt to get in the room with somebody or start the conversation off. Because otherwise, everybody's just going to have their head down and, like, you know, I have a job, I have a family, I have responsibilities I'm supposed to be worried about. And, like, that's fine. Like, none of that is, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. It's just breaking yourself out of that thought process and pattern is, like, really hard. And I don't think that gets talked about nearly enough.
I mean, people have things to do, right? And so you have to manage your priorities. And, you know, thankfully for the vast majority of people, this is stayed a priority for us, that, like, we want to stay in this league and keep up these connections. And, you know, yes, I would absolutely, Lord willing, one of these days I'll stop having the second best overall record and actually win a championship so I can hang my hat on something. But even if I never win it, just the fact that, like, I'm a part of this thing that has lasted for 10 years and I'm heading back to my hometown to do an in-person draft with people, like, that's unique and cool and something that people don't talk about.
There are many, many articles and research papers out there about the loneliness that many people experience after graduating college and transitioning into early adulthood, especially in the 21st century. And we've all had our fair share of that, don't get me wrong. But having something to connect us to each other and tie us back into who we are, even if it's something as silly as fantasy football, is enormously underrated. But I think we all recognize at this point that no matter what the league looks like a few years from now, or even if it ends tomorrow for some reason, we made something pretty special. And I think it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about why that is. The reason that I think our league feels different or special is that it kind of runs counter to a couple of pretty important sociological trends. Namely, the breakdown of fantasy football as an idea, and secondly, the breakdown of social institutions more generally. Let's unpack that first one for a minute. When it started in 1962, fantasy football was just a game invented by a group of Raiders executives and season ticket holders as a kind of boredom cure. The team would spend weeks out on the East Coast for road games, and people like Raiders minority owner Bill Winkenbach wanted a way to keep things interesting. And so, fantasy football was born as the Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League, or GOPPPL. Honestly, at that point, I don't think the acronym is all that helpful. But 60 years later, the landscape of fantasy football has moved way, way beyond a hotel room in Buffalo. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now with its own media landscape. And strangest of all to me, the target audience and the message to those people has completely changed too. Like, back in 2007, fantasy football commercials were just videos of Neil Rackers kicking CGI field goals. That was it. That was the whole video. Just Mark Bulger throwing footballs at down markers and telling you to pick him for your team. Fast forward to 2024, and the packaging for fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy, looks pretty different. Like, genuinely. Fantasy football going from a niche thing for nerds to a kind of bro culture thing that you market together with beer and boobs has got to be one of the weirdest pivots ever. But there have been other behavioral changes with it too. Fantasy football has always run parallel to the gambling scene. Like, there's a story from one of the guys who founded that original league where he and his friends tried to get stats from the NFL so they could make better draft decisions, but the league said no because they thought they were bookies. A loophole in an internet gambling law from 2006 opened the door for companies like FanDuel and DraftKings to become dominant forces in the space, and even though that has not gone unchallenged, the landscape of fantasy sports was still changed pretty much permanently. And that change has not gone unnoticed by academics.
I would notice how negative people were and how emotional people seemed to get with their posts about fantasy football. And I just thought, like, this is crazy, right? This is a hobby, and people are so passionate, and it means so much to people. And of course, you know, people are passionate about hobbies. That's why you have a hobby. But this seemed to be different.
To get a better grasp on how fantasy sports has changed over the years, I reached out to Dr. Luke Wilkins, a sports science researcher at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Luke and his team have since written a series of papers on the effects of fantasy sports on mental health and how we can better understand the relationship between the two. And I will say, just for the sake of transparency, that because Luke is clearly English, when he talks about fantasy football, he means things like Fantasy Premier League. But I did ask him, and he said that the same kind of thought process would probably apply to American football too. So, what did they find? And what can it tell us about the current state of fantasy sports? This is kind of the classic non-committal academic answer, but the truth is that it's complicated. The bad news is that the current climate of fantasy sports does present legitimate mental health concerns. The emotional highs of doing well in fantasy can be very high, but this study also shows that the lows can be a lot lower than a lot of people realize, especially when there's money on the line. But the good news is that the mental and social engagement element of fantasy sports can actually be very positive for mental health, as can the competitive element. I hadn't even really thought about this until I talked to Luke, but under the right circumstances, his research showed that fantasy sports can actually be a kind of non-threatening outlet for people with gambling issues.
There's a lot of people that do say that fantasy sports is good for their gambling because it's a different release. I guess it's kind of like the equivalent of e-cigarettes. Like it gives them that buzz without having the as harmful effects as of spending money on natural gambling.
There's a lot more in that paper that I can't really give the time it deserves here, so if you want to read the updated version that just came out, I'll put a link to it in the video description. But it was really insightful for me, because generally speaking, I don't think fantasy sports are in a great place right now. Not financially speaking, of course, and in that sense, they're absolutely killing it. But while I'm not morally opposed to sports betting being legal or to fantasy football being monetized, from a psychological perspective, I do think it's a pretty bold choice to be so shamelessly and liberally promoting a behavior that is known to be addictive. But to connect that conversation back to our league, I would argue that there are still people out there who are treating fantasy football in the same way that those Raiders guys were back in the 60s. They may not be getting as many national TV commercials, but they are still out there. And I would argue that while they're not as exciting or as high stakes as those other leagues, like our league just added a $10 buy-in a couple of years ago, the more old school fantasy leagues could be a pretty interesting strategy in trying to solve what I see as one of the biggest social problems in our current landscape. This is my friend Will, which I recognize is slightly confusing because my name is also Will, but I've saved Will for last for a very good reason. This other Will works in investing, but saying that by itself, while technically accurate, doesn't really fully describe the kind of work that he does. Like, he definitely does help people and businesses figure out how best to spend their money, but he also spends a lot of time studying the behavior and mental patterns of those people, including but not limited to how we as a society are struggling to form or maintain connections to each other.
I think it's something like 15% of US adults cannot identify like a close friend. Maybe a quarter can only identify one, and those are like no less lonely than those who can't identify any.
This tracks completely with what Dr. Maheux was talking about earlier. The world in 2024 is a very lonely one, which at least helps to explain some of the ways that we behave towards each other. And it affects all of us, but it's important to point out that it doesn't affect all of us in quite the same way.
There's a lot of data and studies, I think, just anecdote perhaps, that say that like women in general, broad strokes of course here, do very well in conversation like face-to-face, right? So if you like go to a coffee shop, like maybe that's the kind of conversation you see happening more than with men at a coffee table. But men do really well, I think, side by side, right, in conversation. So guys will like go for a run, or they'll hop on a bike, or, you know, they're staring at a fire, right, in somebody's backyard, right? That's playing video games, like that kind of thing.
Will went on to point out that fantasy football leagues like ours would also be the kind of social situation where men could make more and better connections with each other. And it's not that I don't trust him, but just to make sure, I did look to see what the research says about how men and women build friendships. And from what I found, Will's pretty much dead on. While women tend to build deeper relationships that are experienced face-to-face, male relationships tend to be structured around some kind of shared activity. And not only do men and women behave differently in friendships, but they may actually have different definitions of what friendship is in the first place.
Men in particular can struggle with friendship or to identify their relationships later in life, in their 30s as opposed to 20s, as friendship for a few reasons. One of those things, I think, is a deterioration in our world of institutions, right? Like you have these kinds of things that are touch points, that are formalized groups that kind of stave off, I think, some of that isolation. But I think those are becoming increasingly rare in a busier, in a more digitized world.
This is another idea that the research does seem to support. In 2023, Gallup published a poll that showed that since 2021, public confidence has decreased either slightly or significantly in every single one of the 16 institutions they measured. And these weren't just the heavy hitters that you'd expect people to be a little suspicious of, like the government or the media. This included things like small businesses, the public school system, or organized religion. Not only is our world becoming more digitized, but as we lose belief in the stuff that's supposed to be holding us together, it's becoming more every man for himself, too. But my main argument in this section, and maybe in this whole video, honestly, is that in that sense, there's a lot more to our league than initially meets the eye.
Our league, in some ways, is an institution. Like, there are a set of rules, there is membership that can be granted or revoked. There's a common set of standards. There are meetings. Like, there are times where we try to gather together physically and personally. We're able to discuss things, to reconnect, to even talk about the future of the league, to have an annual draft. There's rituals, right? Of playoffs, of trades, of what have you. There's a shared language and common communication structures, whether it be in GroupMe or, just trash talk, right? It's provided, at least for me, I think, an institution that is easier to kind of grasp a hold of.
The world that we currently inhabit is full of confusing paradoxes. We're more connected than we ever have been through technology, but that's also led us to being more lonely and divided. We have all sorts of evidence about the importance of being a part of something, and yet we're more resistant to the things to be a part of than we ever have been. So what do we do about all that? Is the takeaway here that we should all start fantasy football leagues with our friends and that'll solve all the world's problems? Well, no, but not because I don't think that's a good idea. The reality of our league is just that all of us are young, white men from a very particular part of the United States. And because of that, there's only so much we can take away from our experiment. But that doesn't mean we can't take away anything, especially when it comes to what we've all individually and collectively learned about transitioning from being a 20-something college graduate to a person in your 30s and beyond.
There's a couple things needed to make it through, I think, this season that many of us in this league found ourselves in. You need two things. One, you need endurance, right? So it's less of a sprinting and falling apart and more just a constant, steady riding the ebbs and flows of these things. And I think that ritual and institutions help with those things, to have a constancy of a thing. Well, I may not know at all where I may be living in a few months, or if my child's ever going to stop having ear infections or whatever, but I know that the NFL draft is coming up, which means that the fantasy football draft is coming up, which means that I may get to see my friends and have a good time, right? Like, there's something to that. But the other side of that coin, in addition to endurance, one of the primary ways we endure is with friends who are in a similar stage of life, who understand the ebbs and flows, right? And I just think that something like a Dynasty fantasy football league started with people that, you knew quite well in your 20s, really, I think, helps provide some of that friendship needed to endure a lot of the difficulty, I think, that comes in 30s.
The original plan for this episode was to do a kind of week-by-week analysis of the 10th season of our league, but as I talked to people, I realized more and more that was just not a good idea. The story of our league, in my now very well-informed opinion, is less about fantasy football than it is about how social institutions can help maintain friendships in one of the loneliest times in our lives. And on the back of that, my closing argument is that it may be time to rethink what those institutions actually look like and how we relate to them. Especially for young men who, as we've established, are more likely to develop friendships through a shared activity anyway, how we engage in those activities may be the key to breaking through the isolation.
Being really active for a top contributor, like a Reddit subgroup, where you don't know names, you don't know faces, there's no incarnational or embodied experience or relationship that can't substitute for knowing your neighbor, right? Or belonging to a gym or like a fitness club or a church or something like that.
Our greatest success as a league is being able to connect a more 21st century way of communicating in fantasy football with a more traditional, institutional way of connecting with each other. If you do it right, I think it makes both experiences better and deeper. Your in-person relationships are enriched by shared activity, and as many people in our league will tell you, the competition within the league itself will be better in every sense of the word.
That social and like relational capital, really, it magnifies the desire for everyone, including me, to win. I mean, really. And so, to me, it raises the stakes a lot. Like, even though we just started having a buy-in, last year? I think it was the first year we had a buy-in. But like, we almost, we didn't even need, because it was just like the buy-in is like wanting to beat the other guys, you know?
I know I've spent a super long time talking about all the reasons that our league is still around, but at the end of the day, the thing that keeps us invested in our league is that we're invested in each other. And because of that, again, paradoxically, we want to beat each other by as many points as possible. Even if this video doesn't inspire you to go out and start your own fantasy league, I do hope that it's gotten you thinking about how people in general and you yourself connect with the world. We're into the fantasy football playoff weeks now, which means that in the not too distant future, we're going to know the winner of our league's 10th season. It's not going to be me, but I did get to share our story with you guys. And to me, that's worth more than any fantasy league title. In theory, anyway. I'll let you guys know if I ever actually manage to win one. Hi, everybody. Thank you guys so much for making it all the way to the end of this thing. I've been wanting to tell this story for a really, really long time, and to finally be able to share it with you is just the best feeling. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the channel by joining our Patreon page at the link in the episode description. Going forward, I want to tell more stories like this one. My hope is to do at least one of these special episodes a year going forward. Hopefully about something that you guys find interesting, and definitely about something that I find interesting. For the time being, though, I'm going to take some time off and recuperate. For me, and from all the guys in our league, thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.